So I've been intrigued by Action Mailbox since it was released in Rails 6. And it allows you to route incoming emails into your Rails application, which I always thought offered up some really interesting possibilities. But while I was intrigued by it, I was also a little bit intimidated as, my mind's like, am I gonna have to set up like an SMTP server and somehow configure it to pass the messages to Rails? And like, do I actually really want to manage another service? Um, but recently I found a great but simple use case for processing emails inside of a Rails app and decided it was just time to just give it a shot. So from February this year, Google and Yahoo will be enforcing some stricter requirements for bulk senders of email. They define bulk as at least 5,000 emails per day. While there's a whole range of stuff in those restrictions, for the sake of this talk, I'll just be focusing on the email authentication requirements. Now, the form of authentication that most people are familiar with is the sender policy framework, or SPF records. This is just a DNS text record that includes a list of IPs or domains that are authorized to send email on your behalf. So for example, if you use Google for your email, your SPF record looks something kind of like this, where the vehicle's SPF1 just declares that you're using version 1 of the SPF standard, and the include statement states that Google is allowed to send email on your behalf. That little like tilde all at the end, it just says that explicitly you don't permit anyone else to send on your behalf. If you wanted to include a Shopify store to include transactional emails, you could just add another include attribute. And while there's a limit on how much you can include, it's quite flexible. You can also you could also add in a web server domain. Like, it's quite configurable. But unfortunately, SPF is far from foolproof. The sending address that is authorized by SPF is not the one that's shown to you in your email client. And so spammers can use an authorized envelope from address, but still spoof the from address that you see in the email. And so along came domain keys identified mail, or DKIM, which is a public-private key used for generating a hash that gets added to your email headers. And for each sending server generates a private key, and they provide you with a public key to be added to your DNS record. And then when you're sending a message, the sending server will include the fully qualified domain of the public key that was used to create that hash. So if you send your email via Google, the DKIM looks something kind of like this. Just like the SPF record, there's a version number, but then you provide a key type and the public key itself. The combination of SPF and DKIM provides a pretty solid way of verifying the authenticity of emails. However, it doesn't provide any guidance to the receiving server as to what to do if the email fails those checks. If an email passes DKIM authentication but fails SPF, should it be quarantined? Each vendor makes their own decision on this on a case-by-case basis, and this leads to inconsistent behavior. This brings us back to the Google Yahoo announcement. Bulk senders will now be required to include a domain-based message authentication reporting and conformance policy, which thankfully we refer to as DMARC. At the minimum, DMARC tells the receiving server what to do if the message fails the authentication check. So this can be achieved by supplying the minimum two required tags, version and policy. As with SPF and DKIM, version simply says the version of the protocol that you're using, while policy tells the server what to do if the check fails. And it can be any of none, I don't do anything, just deliver the message, quarantine, send it to the spam folder, or reject, which means the message just doesn't get delivered at all. So while DMARC requires some effort, enforcing it will have a net positive outcome for anyone who uses Google for email, and like 5 people who use Yahoo. We don't have time to go through the whole standard, but there are some valuable tags that you should read about when implementing DMARC. 2 that are important to this discussion are RUA and RUF. They allow you to define an email address that should receive reports about the deliverability of your emails. So this solves one of the biggest issues in spam prevention, which is knowing why your legitimate emails are being sent to spam. So far, I've only implemented the RUA, which relates to aggregate reports of all the emails being sent. So every day, the receiving mail servers send me an XML report, which is either zipped or gzipped. And those reports let me know the sending servers that sent the email from my domain and the deliverability of those emails. I intend to start evaluating the RUF, which provides more like forensic information. It's like an email by email breakdown of exactly why it failed. But I figured that the aggregate reports were a good starting place. What I found, however, is that even the aggregate reports are actually quite overwhelming to review manually. So since each receiving server is sending you an email, you can expect to receive many emails a day, and each has a compressed XML file in it. And as we know, XML is not designed to be human readable. This is what brought me to Action Mailbox. I wanted to know that I could be informed of deliverability issues without having to actually read the XML reports. And the first thing I noticed is that the Rails guides for configuring Action Mailbox are actually pretty good. The problem, however, is that most of the work is setting up the mail server. So the guide gives you a couple of simple commands to run, which ensure that both Action Mailbox and active storage are enabled. Emails can be quite large, at least in database terms. And so the table generated for Action Mailbox really just stores some like simple metadata about the email, while active storage is used to store the content of the email itself. And so if you don't already use active storage, you'll want to read the guide for configuring it, because while it works fantastically out of the box in development, you need to supply a location for the files to be stored in production. So for me, that's AWS S3, which is just one of the defaults that's available. Like at this point, you might feel the desire to configure the email receiving server. So in my case, like AWS. But I found that while you go most of the way, Amazon sends a message to your server and expects to receive a successful response. So if you fully configure AWS before you've configured Rails, it's not going to get the success message. If you're concerned about integration, concerned about the integration, you could configure Rails just enough to respond to those messages and perform a deployment. But given I was just parsing some pretty simple XML files, I just did the small task locally and pushed it up when it was ready. There isn't actually a lot you need to understand to build your mailbox. In many ways, the process is actually really similar to routing web requests to a controller. The install script creates an application mailbox class, which, apart from being the base class for mailboxes, acts like a routes file. And so you define a regex, which routes messages to a mailbox. So in this case, I'm routing all the emails that come to my DMARC subdomain to the DMARC mailbox. And then while we don't have time to dig into the quirks of how I parse the emails, the structure of the mailbox is stupidly simple. Your entry point is the process method, and you have access to a method called inbound email, which is just that wrapping record that stores the metadata about the message. I haven't found it to be particularly valuable when it comes to the actual processing part of this. But you can call mail on the inbound email, and that will trigger active storage to download the message, which is then wrapped in this like mail message object. And that's where all the important stuff is. That's where you get access to your body and you access to the attachments, that sort of thing. If anyone actually decides to process DMARC reports, I would be more than happy to go into the deep details on that. But essentially, I'm just unzipping the attachment, passing it to Nokogiri, and then searching for any issues in there. And then I just send myself a human readable email if there's anything I actually need to address. Testing my code was actually really simple to do. Not only can you create automated tests, but Rails has a conductor controller, which is basically just a CRUD for reviewing and creating emails. And during development, I had the reports sent to my personal email address, and then I would just copy the source from the emails into Conductor, and that would just run through the whole process as if I'd actually hooked it in. Before deploying, I also used ngrok to test that the route actually worked, but I found that the Conductor was just as good as ngrok, but simpler to work with. If there were going to be any deliverability issues, in my opinion, they're probably more likely to have something to do with your production environment rather than that routing. And with the mailbox complete, it's now time to start configuring the email server that will receive the reports. So since I deploy to and send my emails from AWS, I wanted to use the Amazon Simple Email Service. Unfortunately, Amazon isn't one of the officially supported options, but someone has been working on adding AWS support, and they seem to be pretty close on that. And the same author has a gem that will patch it for the meantime. I actually tested Action Mailbox with Mailgun as well, which is one of the supported options. And I confirmed that like apart from adding in this gem, the process is actually really similar. So the gem's actually a great stopgap until the official PR's approved. It also means that while the interface I'll be showing is different, the way you set up email delivery in AWS will have conceptual similarities with the other providers. And because I already use SES for my outgoing email, I'd already verified my domain with SES. If it's your first time that you're using SES, you do need to follow their guide to create a verified identity. And all that involves, it's actually now just creating a DKIM record, which just proves to AWS that you manage that domain. It is valuable to know that I didn't need to verify a subdomain. I verified my root domain, and that gave me permission to configure inbox email for subdomains as well. And then once complete, you can pop down in SES to the email receiving and create what they call a rule set. Creating a rule set really involves nothing more than like giving it a meaningful name. And then you can begin adding rules that define what AWS should do when that email is received. So the settings for a rule are pretty straightforward. You give it a name. You can restrict the rule to only a subset of emails if you want to, or you can simply skip this section and it's just a catch-all. Certainly for my tests, I haven't bothered restricting it yet, but I would probably, as I advance on this, I imagine I'll be a little bit more strict on it. Then the secret source is telling SES to publish the message to the simple notification service, to a simple notification service topic. So SNS can forward messages to web addresses. So emails passed by SES to an SNS topic can then be forwarded to your Rails app. And you can actually create the SNS topic from the screen in SES. You just want to make sure that you set the encoding type to UTF-8. The default is base 64, and I found that just does not work. But from the SES side, that's it. Like now, the simple email service is done. You create the rule, you set it as active, that's it. Next, you need to move over to SES to find the topic that you just created. And like so many things in AWS, the SNS topic includes an ARN. And this is used by the gem to decide whether or not to listen to messages from SES. So you need to include the ARN in the subscribed topics of your Action Mailbox configuration. And this is one area where AWS does differ from Mailgun, and I'm assuming probably all the other officially supported ingress options, where normally you would just add your credentials to the Rails encrypted credentials or to an environment variable, and by some magic, it all just works. But this is the point where you do need to deploy. Because if we go back to SNS now, you can add a subscription, which is nothing more than a URL to your application. And the URL will always be your domain followed by this fixed Rails path that can be found in the Rails guide. And as I mentioned earlier, when you save this URL, SNS will send a subscription notification to your application, and the gem knows how to handle that. So you don't need to be involved in that process. You just need to make sure that your app is ready to receive the message. From there is now building your MX record, because obviously whenever you're want to send an email somewhere, there needs to be an MX record telling the internet where to send that email. So the process will differ from provider to provider. So you'll have to read their instructions on it. But for Amazon, it was really simple. They basically have the same structure for all of their MX records of this inbound SMTP, some region name, and then AmazonAWS.com. So since I use the Sydney region, I use the AP Southeast 2 in the domain. And I configured this on a subdomain that I have allocated exclusively for sending emails to AWS. Finally, you create your DMARC record. I would certainly recommend starting with the record that informs receiving mail servers to always deliver messages. Within a day, I found a few services that were legitimately sending emails on behalf of my domain, but they'd never actually been given approval to do it. And so it allows you to find those issues, clean them up before you start quarantining those messages. But once I had them cleaned up, then I increased from none to quarantined. I do intend to eventually upgrade to reject once I'm confident that all the legitimate emails are delivered. But obviously the problem with reject is that the email is never delivered. And so no one can say to you, oh yeah, I found it in the spam folder. Like they just will never get the message. And the only other thing I thought that was worth mentioning is that Rails defaults to deleting these emails after 30 days. So when the email comes in, an active job is scheduled for the future. This is customizable, but I figured for the sake of like DMARC reports, 30 days seems sensible enough to me. But it is something you'd want to configure. If you needed to have long-term access to those emails, you're going to have to change that. The guide suggests that they set this default on the basis that you probably shouldn't be keeping people's personal information that long. But if you've got a use case where it's justifiable, then you could change it. Or on the other hand, if you need to get rid of them quickly, you can modify. But otherwise, that is it. And I am open to questions. Yes.
Is there the use case that you were like, why you were looking at this? Maybe I missed something at the start.
So
why were you?
Have you ever looked at XML?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not super readable. And so these reports, the reports that the server sends you, they all come in this like computer readable format that you can technically parse, but like realistically, it's too difficult.
I mean, even further back.
Oh, why did I?
Is this a work thing, just personal?
Oh,
what's the use case in general about?
Like every service under the sun has been emailing people saying that if you don't enable this, we're going to stop sending your emails. For me, the trigger was really Shopify. Once Shopify said we're not going to send your emails anymore, I was like, okay, I have to actually deal with this now. Usually those services will tell you that you need to do this because the requirement is 5,000 emails a day. You have to be sending a lot of email for it to actually matter. To be honest, I'm not even sure that it would. I haven't actually validated that I would have had any problems if I didn't do this, but it gave me a reason to read more into what DMARC actually was. And when I found out that I could get deliverability reports, it figured like that could just solve a massive problem. So I mean, so often people are like, oh yeah, the email went to junk, sorry, I couldn't get it. And you're like, I don't really know why. So, nothing else? And nothing in the chat. No. Oh, Anthony, yes.
Because the second one.
DKIM, yep.
Yep. Because it's better protection, do you actually need SPF?
Oh, it's a great question. I don't know if I'm qualified to answer that question. I haven't yet thought, I have thought about it. I haven't thought of a situation where you could work out what the private key was or steal the private key even, like, unless there was like, you know, like AWS or something, or Google had their data stolen. It's hard to think of a situation, but I wouldn't want to tell you outright. It's not needed anymore. Yeah, for sure.
Does your application or the mail server validate the SPF, DKIM, and DMARC of the reports that are sent to it?
No. So when you set up an SES address, one of the options is to say, should AWS do spam checking? And I'm assuming that AWS is checking the SPF and DKIM records of the server sending the emails, but I haven't validated that. Yeah. I had wondered though whether it's actually smart to turn that setting on. Like, am I potentially going to miss out on emails that I shouldn't because I'm going to be using this for DMARC? I think it's safe to assume that those servers know what they're doing, or the companies building these servers know what they're doing. Like, realistically, you're mostly just getting emails from Google, Microsoft, and Fastmail. Right? There's just not that many providers out there. They do send a lot of email, but not that many providers. I think they've got it covered. But yeah, I haven't checked. Sorry. Yeah. They are, yes. Yeah, like everything, Amazon, everything has to be split into 10 different components. So SES is this, Amazon's simple email service, and SNS is Amazon's simple notification service. So simple, particularly when those initialisms are so close together that you have to stumble over them. It's like how every time I had to think about whether or not it was action or active. Sorry, did you have another question?
It's more a comment. Recently I discovered that Cloudflare added support for DMARC reports, which is free on their service. I haven't really used them, but I know they added. I'm excited.
Cool. In case the remote people didn't hear, apparently Cloudflare has support for reading your DMARC reports for you, which could be a very interesting way of not having to go through this process. Cool. That's it. All right. Thank you so much.